Hey there, and welcome to another Ask Me Anything session where I am answering all your questions about the publishing industry and how to write a stronger story. I love getting to do these videos every week because I hear questions that you all have that weren't necessarily even on my radar, and it's really helpful for me to know what you all are wondering and what you're going through. So I want to say thank you to everyone who is watching these videos and leaving me questions. Let's get some housekeeping out of the way before we dive into today's questions. First things first, if you're watching and haven't subscribed already, what are you waiting for? Please join this amazing community of storytellers. While you're down there and hitting that subscribe button, go ahead and hit that thumbs up button for the YouTube algorithm, and scroll down into the description below and you'll find a link to a free resource I created for my YouTube community. It is called my Story Self-Assessment Worksheet, and it is a short quiz that is going to help you evaluate your own story from an outside perspective and therefore identify what's working well in the current draft and where you could improve it on the next one. That's also going to sign you up for my newsletter where I interview industry experts and published authors to get their unique insights, so you don't want to miss out on that. And if you don't need the worksheet, there is a link directly to sign up for my newsletter in the description below. So we have some really important questions on deck today, so let's dive right in. First question here. I have a question. Can you talk a little bit about overdone concepts? I hear agents say that they often see the same story idea many times in their inbox, but don't often elaborate on what those are. And as writers, we have no idea if what we think is unique is actually what everyone else thinks unique is. This is a really excellent question, and I totally understand your frustration with literary agents saying they don't want overdone concepts and you have no sense of what those overdone concepts are. I wish I could sit here and give you an entire list of tropes and cliches that literary agents are tired of seeing in their inboxes, but the truth is, there is no list like that. It doesn't exist. Because the publishing industry is subjective. So what is a cliche or a trope or overdone to one literary agent is not the same for another literary agent. And the other thing is, many movies and TV shows and books that are published today actually do incorporate a lot of tropes, such as a love triangle, for instance, or an enemies to lovers type of storyline. And yet they still work, right? So in those cases, the trope or the overdone aspect actually wasn't a disadvantage at all. What I think a literary agent is really saying if they say that they feel your story idea is overdone or cliche or a trope of some kind is just that it didn't feel unique enough to them. It wasn't something when they're scrolling through Netflix that they're going to click on, right, to give you an analogy. But that doesn't mean it's not going to feel unique to another literary agent. Now, that's not very helpful to you because you're sitting there wondering, how do I find that literary agent who's going to understand the unique qualities of my story? You just have to keep querying and keep reaching out to agents. What you can do as well is take another look at your query letter, specifically the plot blurb section. Are you highlighting what is really the hook in the premise of your story? Think about that hook as that element of your story that is different from anything else you've seen out there. You mentioned that you feel yourself that your story is unique. You don't feel like you're falling into tropes or cliches. So what is that unique element that you're offering? Is it a setting that's not often explored in fiction? Is it a character whose voice has really never been heard in mainstream fiction? Lead with that in your query letter, and I think more agents are going to see the unique aspects of your story and not so much the overdone aspects. Because as I mentioned earlier, certain tropes and cliches are not necessarily weaknesses in your story. And in fact, there are many tropes that continue to work. I have a whole video on them that I'll link in the description here. So I want you to detach from the idea of, I have to avoid cliches, I have to avoid overdone genres, for instance. Instead, just think about the story you've produced and what is unique about it. Here's another question. I am currently writing a novel that is very much a passion project, and it is my goal to get it published, and so far it is going well. Congratulations, that's awesome. However, my last experience with writing a novel stopped midway at chapter 14 of 30 planned chapters. Somehow I had a slump of no motivation or feeling dried out, even though I still loved the story. What is your advice to avoid this slump? It sounds like a version of you hitting writer's block, right? Which is the dreaded feeling of not knowing where to take your story. You cannot put words down on the page. I do have some tips for overcoming this slump or writer's block. I have a whole other video actually that goes into my top pieces of advice for that, so I will link it in the description here for you to check out. But in short, my biggest piece of advice comes down to trying to put yourself in a position where you can see your story from a different perspective and a different lens, because that often will get the creative juices flowing. That could be changing up your writing routine or creating a writing routine if you haven't made one already, changing the location where you're writing, changing what you're writing on. Maybe it's physical versus a laptop, or maybe you change your laptop to a desktop. Just little things like that, tactical things, can make a big difference. Also, asking yourself questions about your main character, asking yourself questions about the setting. All of these things can help you flesh out aspects of your story and see it from a new light. Another tip is to just work on something else in the meantime, because it can be so helpful to actually get your head out of the story that you're currently stuck on and into something entirely different. And when you can be productive on that other story, that productivity can then flow into the draft you're stuck on, and you can bring that creative juice over to the story that still needs to be finished. I hope some of those tips help, but definitely check out my other video on writer's block for some more in-depth pieces of advice. Here's another question. I've completed the first draft of a manuscript, and I'm now going through my first round of developmental edits. I have a plan, I know what's missing and what needs to be improved on, but I'm finding that editing/revising is even more tedious than drafting the story, and I'm finding it difficult to stay motivated. To make matters worse, I'm feeling called to work on other ideas and other stories that I've shelved in my mind, but I feel reluctant to start something new, especially when I've been working on the current manuscript for over a year. I really want to polish it as much as I can before starting something else. Any advice for someone going through the second draft blues? I have absolutely heard of the second draft blues. As someone who is on the opposite end of the table and providing the developmental edits, I totally sympathize with your position of receiving those edits and just feeling overwhelmed and feeling like you frankly don't want to do them. Developmental and structural editing is hard work. It's arguably harder than getting the first draft down, because now there are all these pieces of the story that need to be reshaped, moved, tweaked, entirely omitted, whole new sections of the book that have to be written in. It is not for the faint of heart, and you are absolutely not alone in feeling overwhelmed by the revising process. So how do you overcome it? You're saying you feel reluctant to work on something else, but in line with the last question I just answered, it can actually be really helpful to get your mind in something else. First things first, if you haven't taken a step away from your manuscript for, say, 2 weeks to a month, you really need to do that, because having that time away from the manuscript is actually going to allow you to return to it with much fresher eyes. It is very difficult to just power through a developmental edit and not actually take yourself away from the manuscript. In that period when you are away from the manuscript, if you feel so inclined to work on another story, there's absolutely no reason why you can't do that. It is actually going to help you get back in that writing mindset, and it could unlock something in your brain that then allows you to turn back to the revisions with newfound purpose and productivity. In fact, whenever I take a manuscript from one of my clients, I tell them to go either do nothing related to writing if they're so inclined, or to work on something else. And plenty of my clients do have multiple works in progress that they are bouncing between. And that's how they keep their focus, because whenever they've taken a break from one manuscript to do something else, they can come back to that other manuscript and the revisions flow so much stronger. Writing is a creative art, right? It is not linear. It doesn't even follow a specific methodology in many cases. So whatever works for your process works for you. I get that you want to finish this draft, you just want to close the book on it and say it's done, but to be honest, you're not likely to feel that it's done even after this next draft. You're going to continue to be refining it, likely over several more drafts, so don't rush it. Let it take the time that it organically needs to take, and if that means taking a step away and getting your head in something else for a little bit because you feel the drive to do so, I would say let yourself do that. I hope you liked the questions today and found my responses interesting. If you did, please go ahead and hit that like button. It would mean a lot to me. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. And if you have a question for me, leave it in the comments here. This is how you enter the queue that I review when I'm going through and answering these questions, and I'd love to hear what's on your mind. Also, don't forget that free resource in the description below, as well as the link to my newsletter. Thank you so much for watching, and happy writing.